Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to Seriously Now. I'm Lex Carline, and I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. Now, today might be a bit of a loopy one because I'm feeling a little bit, although I might not sound it, odd. I am dosed up on cough medicine and a load of coffee, and yeah, everything just feels like it's going ding 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 ding. So the crash later is gonna suck, but hey, for now, let's enjoy it. So today is part 2 of Fred and Rose. And yeah. So we covered some of the things that the Wests did, how they met, what their early lives were, the deaths of Anne McFall, Charmaine, and Rena West. And today we're going to talk about the rest of it. This one might actually be more disturbing than the last one, so buckle up, trigger warning, all that jazz. Because first off today, we're going to talk about the Cellar Girls. It almost sounds like some kind of band or show, doesn't it? Come and see the Cellar Girls. If only. So in this case, the Cellar Girls are probably exactly what you imagine them to be. The young girls and women, no, the girls and young women even, who were murdered in the cellar and then buried there too. So it's back to October 1972, where 17-year-old Caroline Owens was hired to be the West's nanny. She met the couple after they picked her up while she was hitchhiking on a back road to get home to Cinderford. Definitely can't talk properly today. Right, hitchhiking. If we learn nothing else from Fred and Rose's case, no hitchhiking. Okay, guys? Thank you. Caroline had told the couple that she disliked her stepfather and that she needed a job, so naturally, she was a prime target for the pair. She worked part-time with the then 3 West children, and she was promised that she'd be driven home every Tuesday. When Caroline asked about all the visitors to Cromwell Street, Rose just passed herself off as a masseuse. They do always have an answer, don't they? I mean, I like to think I have an answer for everything, but these guys kind of pretty much do. So Fred claimed to Caroline, and crossed my legs in cringe here, he claimed to be an abortion expert. Yeah. So if she ever needed his services, lovely. And apparently he almost always talked about sex, even claiming that the women he performed abortions for were so grateful that they offered sexual favours as thanks. Somebody's living on planet Delulu. Delusional. But once Fred started making advances towards Caroline, Smart Girl quickly announced that she wanted to leave Cromwell Street and go home. Can't say I blame her. Now, Fred would later say that his plan was not only to rape and probably murder Caroline, but he wanted to see if his wife would help him with an abduction. Couple goals, obviously. December the 6th, 1972, and the Wests apologised for their behaviour and offered Caroline a lift home. And the poor girl, bless her, believed that they were being genuine. I mean, she had no reason to think otherwise. Rose would claim that she wanted to have a girls' chat in the back of the car whilst Fred drove. And it went downhill fast from there. Rose started fondling Caroline, whilst Fred asked if she'd had sex with her boyfriend that evening. And it was then she realised that something untoward was happening, and she began to protest. But sadly, Fred would just pull the car over and punch Caroline so hard in the face that it knocked her out. And this was a 17-year-old girl. The couple then tied the girl up with a scarf and duct tape. She was taken back to the cellar of Cromwell Street, where she would be given a drugged tea before being rebound, gagged, sexually assaulted by both Fred and Rose. I don't know what to think of this next statement, because let's see what you think. But Fred would tell Caroline that her clitoris was unusual. What a fucking comment. And then lashed her genitals with a leather belt. Rose restrained Caroline by the neck whilst she performed oral sex on the girl, and would smother her with a pillow if she dared to scream. Now, Caroline quickly realised how dire her situation was, and so she shut down and went into survival mode and stopped resisting, which, strong girl, fair play to her. When you want to fight and go, no, get off me, leave me the fuck alone. But you know the best thing to do is to just stop. It's just, oh. Now, Fred issued the threat that they could keep Caroline in the cellar and let their black friends abuse her, and then he'd bury her under the paving stones of Gloucester. Fred also claimed that he'd murdered hundreds of young girls and that she had been brought to the house primarily for Rose's pleasure, not his. After everything that they had already put that poor young girl through, Fred and Rose then had the gall to ask her if she'd return to work for them. Like, fuck no. Which is why I probably would have been buried in that cellar. Because obviously this presented an opportunity for an escape plan. And yeah, I don't think my brain would go here, but well played, Caroline, because she would actually undertake chores to prove that she was willing to be an extended family member and work for the Wests again. Now, thankfully, Fred and Rose took Caroline at her word, because it was later that same day that Caroline managed to escape from a laundrette, and it was one she'd previously been to with Rose, and she managed to get home to her mum. Now, given everything she'd just been subjected to, I imagine walking wasn't particularly pleasant, never mind anything else. The fact she managed to get away is incredible. Like, really. Now, initially, Caroline was, as you would be, was too ashamed to tell her mum what had happened. But once her mum had seen the marks on her body, she broke down and told her everything. And, as a mum, that must have been absolutely devastating for her mum as well. Naturally, and thankfully, Caroline's mum went straight to the police. So the charges initially brought against Fred and Rose were assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. The case would go to court on the 12th of January 1973, but unfortunately by then Caroline couldn't face testifying in court, which is understandable. But this would sadly mean that some of the charges related to her abuse would be dropped, and so Fred and Rose would plead guilty to the lesser charges of indecent assault and causing actual bodily harm. They were fined £50 each and walked free from court. Justice system fails again. Now, this affected Caroline so deeply that she attempted suicide, bless her. And whilst she did survive, she would never fully recover from her ordeal. I mean, would you? And in 2016, Caroline sadly passed away after battling cancer. May she rest in peace. So the first known murder that the couple committed, outside of family members and poor little Henry, happened about 3 months after the assault charges. Linda Goff was 19 and she had affairs with 2 of Fred and Rose's lodgers, and this is how they met her. Linda would move into Cromwell Street on the 19th of April 1973, and the next day or thereabouts, so pretty damn quickly, Linda was gone. The other tenants were told, after, where is she? What happened to her? That she'd been told to leave after hitting one of the West children, and the same story was even given to Linda's mother. So Linda's dismembered body would be found under an inspection pit in the garage, and to avoid her screams being heard, her jaw had been completely wrapped in tape and 2 small tubes had been stuck up her nose so that she could breathe. Just makes me feel a little claustrophobic just thinking about that. Nope. It was said that Linda was likely suspended from the ceiling beams in the cellar, and there were lengths of string and knotted fabric found with her body. Now Fred, the wonderful creature he is, even admitted carving holes in the beams specifically for suspending victims. Linda's cause of death was likely suffocation or strangulation, and her body was missing 5 cervical vertebrae, a patella, and several finger bones. So the next cellar girl was 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, and she lived in the Pine Children's Home. She vanished on the 10th of November 1973, and detectives concluded that she had been picked up by the Wests whilst hitchhiking. She too was strung up and abused in much the same way as Linda, before being dismembered and buried under the cellar floor as well. I know it was a different time, but again, no more hitchhiking. Thank you, please. Next was Lucy Partington, and she was said to be a clever and much-liked woman who was attending Exeter University, and on the 20th of December 1973, she'd come home for Christmas. 2 days later, she visited a friend's house, but after leaving said friend's house, she would never be seen alive again. Now it's thought that Lucy was picked up by the Wests while she waited for the bus home. Her mother did report her missing, and there was a massive manhunt. Now Geoffrey Wansell, who wrote the book An Evil Love, The Life and Crimes of Fred West, said that Lucy's case seemed to be the one that attracts the most anger, because she was a middle-class Catholic. Now that really fucks me off. Don't know about you, but that really fucks me off. None of these women, or poor little Henry, deserved to be treated or die in this way. No one should. And they should all garner the same outrage. I mean, one of these is a 15-year-old girl. But no, society's just fucked, isn't it? Was then, still is now. Now, I may butcher this next name. Oh, I'm starting to sound happy, sorry. Swiss-born Therese Siegenthaler, who was 21. She was studying for a diploma in secretarial studies at a London college, and she also worked in a ballet shoe shop at weekends. She was described as petite, with blondish mousy hair, and she had intended to hitchhike to Ireland at Easter 1974 to visit a priest friend of hers. It's thought that she was actually a regular hitchhiker, again please don't, and had boasted to friends that she could take care of herself. But Therese would never arrive at her Irish destination. The Met Police actually carried out a years-long investigation, but to no avail. Therese was also found under the cellar floor of Cromwell Street. Then we move on to Shirley Hubbard, another 15-year-old girl, and she is the youngest of the victims found at Cromwell Street. A vulnerable young girl, Shirley had actually been taken into care after her parents separated when she was just 2. Born in Birmingham, Shirley's original surname was Lloyd, although she was known as Owen. But by 1972, she decided that she wanted to be known as Hubbard, but it was never legally changed. And at the time of her disappearance, Shirley was a high school student who also had a work experience placement at Debenhams in Worcester. Oh, Debenhams, another one that's long gone. On the 14th of November 1974, Shirley would leave work, but would never arrive home. She was reported missing to police, but they could find no trace of her, like she'd just vanished into thin air, until she was eventually found under the cellar, courtesy of Fred and Rose West. Now, Juanita Mott was said to be the final cellar victim of Fred and Rose, but sadly not the final victim. Geoffrey Wansell described Juanita as rebellious, strong-willed and difficult, but outgoing and attractive. In April 1975, Juanita left her home in Newent and vanished. It was the day before a friend's wedding. Her family didn't report her missing to the police. Why the fuck not? But they did contact the Missing Persons Bureau and the media. So why not the police as well? What am I missing? Why? Like, it makes sense. After Juanita's murder, cellar was getting a little bit full, really. So Fred would concrete over the cellar floor, and then he turned the cellar. Can you guess what he turned it into? A bedroom for his older children. Nope. Then, for some reason, there seems to be a 3-year break in the West's murderous ways. That we know of, anyway. And then to break the spell, Fred, and possibly Rose, it's unclear whether he acted alone or not, murdered their lodger, 18-year-old Shirley Robinson. So Fred first met Shirley in the cafe that he ran with Bill Letts, Rose's dad, the Green Lantern, in April of 1977. And she would take up lodging with the Wests that very same month. I mean, they didn't waste any time with these girls, did they? And as if murder wasn't bad enough, Shirley was around 8 months pregnant at the time of her death, and the baby was Fred's, so a bit reminiscent of Anne McFall. And Rose had even boasted to her neighbours about the baby being Fred's, and although Rose herself was pregnant, she was said to be hella jealous. So it was all right for Rose to get pregnant and have Fred raise her clients' babies as his own, but when the shoe was on the other foot, funny. I mean, the criminal mind intrigues me no end anyway, but people are fascinating, aren't they? So basically, Shirley was likely killed because she was a threat to the West's relationship stability. Stability? Is there anything remotely stable about these two? Instability, maybe, yes. Shirley would be dismembered, and she was buried in the garden. Her unborn child was removed from her body, and several bones were also missing. More trophies. There were no signs of restraint as there were with the others, so it's suspected that there was no sexual motive for this murder. Maybe because she was so heavily pregnant? Who knows? Now Rose, the cheeky bitch, would even go so far as to submit a claim for maternity benefit in Shirley's name. But thankfully, it was denied. On the off chance anyone would ask about the girl's whereabouts, Fred and Rose would claim that Shirley had gone to live with her father in Germany, which is where the girl had been originally from, so plausible. And the alleged final sexually motivated murder that the couple committed was of Alison Chambers on the 5th of August 1979. Now, she had run away from home to work as a live-in nanny for the Wests in the middle of 1979. And it's thought that Alison only lived with the family for a few weeks or so before she was murdered. She was just 16 years old. Rose had promised the girl that she would be able to come and live on a peaceful rural farm that she and Fred owned, which sounds idyllic. But Alison would be found buried in the garden at Cromwell Street, near the bedroom wall. She was dismembered and was found with a leather belt looped under her jaw and fastened on the top of her skull. Now, Alison had actually kept in regular contact with her family, which could have posed a problem, but not for Fred and Rose. The couple drove to Northampton, or at least Fred did, which is roughly a 2-hour drive from Gloucester, to post a letter that the deceased girl had written previously and throw her family off their trail. Now, for two people who aren't the brightest bulbs, that's pretty good. Okay, good is the wrong word, but you get what I mean. So now we're going to talk about more of the abuse that the West children received, and this starts with the sexual abuse of Anna Marie. Deep breath. In September of 1972, then just 8 years old, Rose took Anna Marie to the cellar and forced her to undress. Rose's impatience saw her rip the dress from the girl when she took too long. Anna Marie would be restrained, and then, whilst Rose actively encouraged him, Fred raped his daughter. Even more sickeningly, if that's possible, Rose took the child to the bathroom, tossed her a sanitary pad for the bleeding, and told her that every father does this to his daughter, making it sound like some sort of rite of passage. She also told her not to worry about it and to categorically not tell anyone about it. It was also made clear that this was not going to be a one-time thing. Ugh. Some people shouldn't be allowed to have children. Now, occasionally Rose would take charge of the sexual abuse, but she seemed to take more satisfaction in making Anna Marie wear miniskirts with sexual devices to do the housework and tying her to the furniture so that Fred could rape her. When she was just 13, Anna was forced into prostitution. Although clients who inquired were obviously told that she was 16 and it was all above board. And Rose was always present to make sure the truth didn't slip out. This poor, poor girl. Not only are you being forced to have sex with people for money, you've got to do it in front of your stepmother. So it was about this time that Rose took Anna to the pub and got her drunk. But the good time was just a ruse. Once they were in the back of Fred's van, Rose began beating her. She even stopped to ask the girl, "Do you think you could be my friend?" What a fucking question. And then both she and Fred sexually assaulted Anna. Anna would eventually get pregnant by her father in 1979, which resulted in an ectopic pregnancy, and as such the pregnancy had to be terminated. Now, an ectopic pregnancy, I don't know if you guys know, is where the egg tries to attach in the fallopian tube and there's not enough space to grow a baby in there. A few days after returning from the hospital after her abortion, Rose would severely beat Anna Marie's stomach, and this would be the catalyst for Anna, and she ran away from home. One got away! Woohoo! But not so woohoo, because obviously with Anna Marie gone, it meant that both Heather and May would become the focus for Fred's incestuous ways. The abuse would only intensify when the girls reached puberty, and Fred's logic was, I made you, so I can do what I want with you. No, sir, that's not how that works. And Fred would actually speak of his desire to impregnate his daughters, It just makes me want to sew myself up, thanks, because that's fucking horrific. Ugh. Heather, May, and Stephen were all very close in age, and they quickly decided that if their father wanted one of the girls to be alone with him, they would only do so if one of the other members of the trio were there. Things were that bad that the girls would only undress and shower when Fred was out of the house or with the other girl on lookout. Could you imagine growing up like this? My brain can't even begin to process. I mean, my childhood wasn't exactly stellar itself, but thank God, or whoever's up there, that I didn't have anything close to this. Now, although the focus was generally on the girls, Stephen wasn't entirely left alone either. He was told that once he reached the age of 17, he would have to start having sex with his mother. But luckily for him, he was evicted when he was 16. Lucky escape. May, whilst being obviously utterly repulsed by her father's gropings, did develop her own coping mechanism. She was somehow able to tolerate it. I mean, the strength of these girls is just phenomenal. And if Fred tried to take it further, she would just laugh it off. Although this did mean she had a hoover thrown at her head for a prior refusal, which was probably the nearest thing to him at the time. In her autobiography, Love as Always, Mum, May tells us that Heather was actually quite badly affected by all of the abuse, even worse than she was. And it was strongly speculated that by 1985-1986 time, Heather had been forced to have sex with her father. She had, by then, developed the classic symptoms of someone who had suffered child abuse. Her nails were bitten so short until they bled. She was always watching her father out of the corner of her eye. Nervousness or fragility in the presence of men. Broken sleep, and then when she did sleep, she'd have nightmares. Constantly jigging when she was sat down. I mean, it's not really surprising, is it, given everything that the girl had been through? I mean, she'd been through the ringer. All these kids had. This distressed behaviour caused Fred and Rose to jump to the completely natural conclusion that Heather was a lesbian. Yeah, nervous, anxious, oh, you must be a lesbian. Your maths isn't mathing. But sadly, them reaching this conclusion meant that Fred would taunt Heather that she was a bitch and she was ugly. And if you've seen a picture of Fred West, is fucking rich coming from him. Now, if Heather dared to protest or show any kind of emotion, Rose would just laugh at her distress. Heather did tell May and Stephen that she wanted to run away to the Forest of Dean. I mean, she could have set her sights a little further, but the forest is a beautiful place. And she wanted to be a nomad and never see another person again. And I can't blame her for that, really. But sadly, that would never come to be. Heather had complained to her school friends about the abuse that they were all suffering at home, and some of her friends had actually noticed the signs of her psychological distress. Hucklecote Secondary School did express their concerns after Heather, who was generally a good student, refused to follow instructions regarding changing her clothes or showering after sport. Once she was forced to take a shower. Christ, imagine a school trying to do that today. Sued. But this is when the school noticed all the bruises, welts, cuts, and things in various states of healing. Heather played this off as marks from where she fought with her siblings. Well, quite a few siblings to fight with, I suppose. But the girl did confide in one friend that it was in fact her parents who had caused the injuries, because her mother had said she was a little bitch who deserved it. No. Oh, no child deserves that. By the mid-80s, rumours of Rose's sexploits had reached several classmates of the West kids. Imagine that. Suppose it's a bit like the kids from OnlyFans mums today. Although it's probably worse today because things are easier accessed. So although the kids had been told not to tell anyone about what happened at home, Heather confided in a friend that some of these rumours were sadly true. Now naturally Heather's friends told their parents, and one of their fathers came to confront Fred and Rose. Somehow they managed to placate the father that Heather had made it all up. And as such, Fred would then escort Heather to and from school because he was so concerned, until she left school in 1986. After leaving school, Heather understandably wanted to escape the House of Horrors and applied for numerous jobs. The further away, the better. The Olbersoil is burning my nose. Okay. On June the 18th, 1987, Heather received the news that unfortunately she had been unsuccessful in her application for a chalet cleaner's job in Torquay. She'd had her heart set on this, bless her, and she broke down in front of May and Stephen, with May saying that she cried all night, and the whole family heard the sobs. But the next day, Heather was said to be back to her normal nail-biting self again when May and Stephen left for school. But this would be the last time that they would see their sister. By the time they returned from school, Heather was gone. The story they were told was that Heather had left to accept the job in Torquay, the one that she'd been refused. And Rose would later tell a neighbour that Heather had run away after a hell of a row. But when the siblings questioned why she didn't call or contact them, after all, they were all exceptionally close, Fred and Rose said that she'd actually eloped with a lesbian lover. And Fred added that searching for Heather would just be a waste of time because Heather was actually on the run for credit card fraud. I mean, really throwing the mud at the wall to make it stick here, aren't they? They would even go so far as to get somebody to phone the house pretending to be Heather. And in the years following, Fred would joke that if the kids were naughty or they dared to tell anyone about the goings-on at 25 Cromwell Street, they would end up under the patio just like Heather. Nice. Fred would go on to build a barbecue in the garden immediately opposite Heather's grave, and he placed a table and chairs on top of her so that the whole family could sit outside together. And Rose approved of this, because of course she did. Now, despite telling people that they had reported Heather as a missing person, Fred and Rose, for obvious reasons, never did. Now, the ever-changing stories about Heather's whereabouts and the allusions that were made about foul play would finally result in police inquiries and culminated in the search warrant to excavate the garden on 25 Cromwell Street. So we're almost at the good bit, but first some more of the bad, as if we haven't had enough in this case. In May of 1992, whilst Rose was out, Fred asked youngest daughter Louise, their youngest child overall was Barry, to carry some bottles upstairs for him. Guess where this is going? Louise's siblings heard her scream, "No, don't." They would later find her writhing in pain and crying. Not only had Fred raped her, but he had also sodomized her and partially strangled her as well. She was 13. When the poor girl confided in her mother, she was met with a cold, "Oh well, you deserved it." No, she didn't. No one ever does. This fucking woman makes my blood boil. I mean, so does Fred, but Rose is... In the following week, Louise would be raped another 3 times, one of which Rose was even present for. She followed Louise, who was bleeding from the assault, and said, "Well, what do you expect?" Oh, she really is the lowest of humanity. Fred would even go so far... Well, Fred's not really any better, is he? Because Fred would even go so far as to film one of the rapes on his daughter. I'm sitting here shaking my head and boffing my microphone. Weeks later, brave Louise would confide in one of her friends about the rapes. The friend told her mother, and thankfully the mother went straight to the police, rather than try to speak to Fred about it. August the 6th, 1992, and the police would finally search the Wests' home, on the pretext of a search for stolen property. Remember, Fred liked his 5-finger discounts. The police would find numerous items of sexual paraphernalia, including 99 porn videos, both commercial and homemade. But sadly, Louise's tape was not one of them. Louise would make a statement to a specially trained solicitor, and she would tell them that the abuse started when she was 11 and that her mother had been indifferent to it all. Thankfully, the children were then taken into foster care the very next day, and medical examinations would reveal the true extent of the abuse that they had endured. The kids revealed that actually their mother was the main physical abuser, and their father would often threaten them that they'd end up under the patio too. A full-scale investigation was launched, and Fred was charged with 3 counts of rape, and 1 of buggery, with Rose as an accomplice. Rose was also charged with child cruelty, inciting her husband to have sex with their daughter, and obstructing police. The couple were also questioned about the whereabouts of Heather. Now, Fred said, this is a quote, "She's alive and well and makes a living as a prostitute." Now, this is his daughter that he killed. She's a prostitute. Okay. And Rose initially claimed to have no idea where her daughter was or why she'd left home. But by the 11th of August, so just 5 days later, and Rose had an epiphany where she could remember now. Of course. Rose said she had encouraged the girl to leave so that the other children wouldn't discover her lesbian inclinations. And this is coming from the woman that would basically sleep with anything. She also said that she gave Heather £600 as an incentive to leave, and she would also claim that she had sporadic phone calls from Heather, making out that the girl was very much still alive. Now, Rose was granted bail the next day, on the proviso that she didn't attempt to contact her children, stepdaughter or husband prior to her trial, and Fred was held on remand in Birmingham and denied he'd done anything wrong. I mean, in his sick head, he probably didn't think that he had. Anna Marie got wind of this, and she wrote a full statement with all her childhood experiences. And I bet that was absolutely harrowing for her to write and also for the police to read. She would give it to Detective Hazel Savage, and it would detail the extensive mental, physical and sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of her father and stepmother. Anna Marie also agreed to testify at their trials, which is, yes, go girl! Anna would also mention to police that she'd been trying to trace her mother Rena and half-sisters Charmaine and Heather for years, but had come up empty. But shortly before Heather had disappeared, she had confided in Anna's husband, Chris Davis, just how unhappy she was at home and how badly she wanted to leave. Sadly, she didn't tell Chris about the sexual abuse, but even without that information, Chris was still so concerned about the girl that he was ready to confront her parents. Bless him. But Heather said to him, "Oh, for Christ's sake, don't. They'll kill us both." Probably not wrong there. Louise would confide in her sister May that, despite everything, she didn't want her father to be charged, so initially May denied that she had been molested as a child. Oh, maybe she didn't want her father to go away and her mother to come back and them just be stuck with Rose. Who knows? So the police efforts were then focused around trying to locate Heather in order to corroborate Anna Marie's claims. The police could find no evidence of Heather being alive, and they checked with the Social Security Department and the Inland Revenue. And just 2 months later, Gloucester Social Services would also contact the police with concern for Heather. Finally, better late than never, I suppose. Now, unfortunately, this case would fall apart when both Louise and Anna Marie refused to testify on the 7th of June, 1993. Louise had said that she wanted to return to her family from foster care, and as such Anna Marie withdrew her statement for fear of Rose and the misery that she could impose on her siblings. God, I suppose if you're Anna Marie, it would be one of those, I don't mind you doing it to me. If you're going to do it to anybody, do it to me. Don't do it to them. It wouldn't be long after this, though, that Anna Marie would speak with DC Savage again to reiterate that her mother and half-sister Charmaine were still missing. Now, despite the charges being dropped, the younger West children would remain in foster care, but they would be allowed supervised visits to Cromwell Street. By this time, most of the remaining members of the family who were not already estranged from Fred and Rose dropped them. Now, I say good, because you don't want to be associated, because you don't want to be associated with family members like that. But it also seems that they abandoned the children as well. Not so good. The police were continuing with their investigation into Heather's whereabouts, and there were still no records to indicate that she was alive anywhere. Anna Marie was questioned by the police about the family's patio joke, and she said she had only ever heard it once and that her father had burst into such hysterics that she simply hadn't believed that it was true. But DC Savage and her colleagues were convinced that Heather was indeed dead and that the family joke might actually be true. They also retraced Fred's steps and as such discovered that Rena and Charmaine were never reported missing, despite disappearing in 1971. I mean, Rena had family up in Scotland. You would have thought that they might have reported her missing. But then I suppose she was disgraced for having Charmaine in the first place. Oh, families are weird things, aren't they? Now we get to the start of the part we've all been waiting for. And on the 24th of February 1994, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, and showed a search warrant to Rose. Rose became hysterical, and I'd say this is knowing because she was, to put it simply, fucked. Now she would shout over her shoulder for eldest son Stephen to get Fred. Fred had been working in Stroud at the time, and he assured Stephen when he called that he'd be back immediately. Now, for context, Stroud to Gloucester is about a 30-minute drive. Fred rocked up 3 hours later. Disposing of something? When he did eventually get home, he told his family that he intended to volunteer a witness statement about Heather's whereabouts. He would tell police again that Heather was alive and well. This time, his elaborate story included a drugs cartel, and that Rose's claims she was under the patio were just rubbish. Which one is more believable to you? Drugs cartel or patio? I'd go patio, and pretty sure the police were on that one as well, because they clearly were not buying it, and Fred noticed. So Fred changed tact and tried to accuse the police of having a grudge against him ever since he was acquitted of the rape of his daughter the year before. Rose gave contradictory information during her informal questioning about Heather's disappearance. Obviously the police were unaware of any others at the time. Well, in connection to this couple anyway. Now when the contradictions were pointed out to Rose, she snapped back with, "Well, I can't fucking remember. It's a bloody long time ago. What do you think I am, a bloody computer?" Well, she was a bit of a machine. The search team left Cromwell Street for the night, but a uniformed officer remained to stand watch. And Fred and Rose were seen that night by May and Stephen whispering to each other in the kitchen and looking at the garden. Walls are closing in on you. Early the next morning, as Stephen was about to go to work, Fred allegedly said to him, "Look, son, look after Mum and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." Really bad might be the biggest understatement there is. So shortly after that conversation, the police arrived back at Cromwell Street to continue searching for Heather. And this is when Fred would tell them that he wished to be arrested for the murder of Heather and to be taken to Bearland Police Station in Gloucester to give a full confession. So Fred was arrested and formally cautioned. At 11:15 a.m. on the 25th of February 1994, Fred gave his admission. But not of murder. No, of manslaughter. He said he strangled Heather in a fit of rage, then dismembered her in the downstairs bathroom with the knife he used for cutting slabs of meat. This is his daughter. And he said he stored her in a dustbin until he dug her grave. He also said that Rose had absolutely no knowledge of what happened to Heather as she was busy with a client. Fred would even go as far as to tell the police that the reason they hadn't found Heather yet was because they weren't digging in the right place. So he volunteered to show them. How generous of him. Sorry, I'm starting to stand. The amount of Olbersoil that is on my jumper. Thank you, child, for bringing yet another lurgy home. It would be down to Fred's solicitor, Howard Ogden, and Fred's court-appointed appropriate adult, Janet Leach, to break the news to May and Stephen. Apparently Stephen just slumped against the wall sobbing, and May went into shock and started stammering that her father couldn't have killed her sister. I mean, even after all the abuse and all the other things, to then jump to murder as well. So the 26th of February, 1994, was when the police began the excavation of the spot that Fred had shown them. And it would be shortly after 4 p.m. that day that they would uncover a human thigh bone, although funnily enough it was in an area that Fred had said they didn't need to check. I mean, did he really think they were going to listen? Now, in the area that Fred had said they would find a body was a mass of human remains encased in bin remnants and 2 lengths of rope intertwined. The remains would be taken back to police HQ, and there it was determined that they were the remains of a young woman, missing a kneecap and several phalanges, remember, finger and toe tips. The victim's fingernails had been found nearby, which is making me clench my hands, which would suggest that she was tortured before she was killed. Dental records would later confirm that this was the remains of Heather West. It was then that Fred was formally charged with his daughter's murder and was also asked by police why there was a third thigh bone. Because you don't see too many 3-legged people scrabbling about. Although if the jokes about some parts of the Forest of Dean are true, I may just be looking in the wrong places. I love the forest, don't come for me. Spent a lot of time there. So after this question, it would be then that Fred confessed that 2 more bodies could be found in the garden and that he again would show them where. Fred named one as Shirley Robinson, who was a heavily pregnant lesbian former tenant, and he lied that the other body was just Shirley's mate. He couldn't, or wouldn't, give her real identity. On the 28th of February, police would find both the bodies, and a couple of days later, Fred would be charged with their murders. So that's 3 sets of remains recovered from the garden alone. Next, the police would begin searching the rest of the property. Now, believe it or not, Rose was actually placed in a safe house in Dursley, around 30 minutes away. Because at this point, Fred was the only one to have confessed to anything, and he'd added that Rose didn't know. Fred would be informed of the extended search, and he'd been in formal interviews which lasted up to 16 hours a day, with persistent questions about the whereabouts of Rena and Charmaine. Once learning about the extended search, it was then that Fred asked his solicitor to pass a note to Superintendent John Bennett, Gloucester PD, the head of the murder investigation. The note was dated the 4th of March 1994, and it read, "I, Frederick West, authorise Howard Ogden to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit a further approximately 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff, and others to be identified. F. West." Approximately 9. Approximately. The fuck? So naturally, Fred was questioned further about this, and he then admitted to the 5 bodies in the cellar and another beneath the ground floor bathroom. Fred had claimed that most of his victims were hitchhikers or girls that he'd murdered in the 70s that he'd just picked up at bus stops. Initially, he said he'd killed the women because they threatened to tell Rose about his infidelity. Yeah, because that makes it okay. Fred said that he'd transported the bodies to Cromwell Street to abuse, dismember and bury. And he said that the dismemberment made it easier to bury his victims in shallow, cubical graves. And he said that he'd show the police each burial site. So between the 5th and 8th of March 1994, the remains of 6 more young women would be found. Each one had been heavily mutilated, with evidence of extreme sexual abuse prior to their deaths. And all of the bodies were missing numerous bones, particularly the phalanges. I suppose the fingers and toe tips are easier to take off, maybe? Unsurprisingly, Fred refused to answer any questions regarding where the missing bones were, or more curiously, why they were missing. I mean, I think we know why. Trophies. But it's always useful to hear it from the horse's mouth. Now, despite Fred's deep protestations that Rose hadn't been involved, the police definitely suspected otherwise. Rose would be arrested, initially on rape charges of a 9-year-old boy and 11-year-old girl from the 70s, on the 20th of April 1994. She would be refused bail and was sent to Pucklechurch Prison, Maximum Security Wing. Rose would be interrogated about the murders, and particularly about Heather West and Linda Goff. On the 24th of April, Rose would be charged with Linda's murder. So Fred and Rose West would be jointly charged with 5 counts of murder on the 6th of May 1994. Rose would simply say, "I'm innocent." Yeah, right. I know, wasn't there. But, yeah, in my opinion, this one, I'm innocent, fuck off. And I'm naturally a blonde, not a redhead. But Rose's I'm innocent would become a bit of a theme in the 46 interviews before her trial. Now, alongside the Cromwell Street victims and Rena, Charmaine and Linda, Fred also confessed to knowing the location of Anne McFall's body, but he always denied killing her. Well, Fred, if you didn't do it, this was before Rose's time. Again, Fred agreed to show police where the remains were. So kind of him. And again, Fred agreed to show police where all of the remains were. So kind. And the rest of the remains were unearthed between April the 10th and June the 7th, 1994. I vaguely remember this going on when I was a kid. But when it's plastered all over the news and the papers. So Fred would be transferred to HMP Birmingham, and there he was placed on suicide watch with his cell to be checked every 15 minutes. At the end of June, so the 30th, 1994, was when the couple were formally charged. Fred, by then, had 12 murder charges, and Rose 9. This would be the first time that the pair had seen each other since Fred was first arrested. But, oh dear, Fred, it wasn't the happy reunion you were hoping for, was it? Prior to all the charges being read, Fred had leaned into Rose and gently put his hand on her shoulder, but she was said to visibly wince away in discomfort. Fred even tried to resist police leading him away and again attempted to get to Rose, but she would wince again and move away. She's done with you, boy. Both Fred and Rose were held on remand, but Fred would be rearrested almost immediately on suspicion of the murder of Anne McFall. Her body had been discovered on the 7th of June, but had only just been identified. He would be formally charged with the murder on the 3rd of July, 1994. Now, whilst he was on remand, Fred's mental health would take a severe nosedive. No, I'm not going to lie, I'm really struggling to find any empathy for this man. I mean, mental health struggles, in my own opinion and from my own experience, are often harder to deal with than physical ones. But when you're a cold-blooded killer, and it's just your guilt getting to you, nah. Fred was said to be very depressed, and it was only made worse when Rose rejected him in court. She refused to answer his letters and had turned to the press to try and play the grieving mother, declaring her innocence of the murders and her hatred of Fred. Cold bitch all the way through. Stephen and Anna Marie would be the only ones to visit Fred in prison, and he would beg them to tell Rose that he loved her. But Rose would never acknowledge him again. She probably blamed him for the reason they got caught, when it wasn't like her mouth did them any favours, was it? Imagine if they'd actually had a decent story about Heather's disappearance. Would we have still had the same outcome? I mean, I'm glad they were dumb as shit, but yeah, I wonder. Now, Rose's refusal to acknowledge Fred would actually backfire on her. So Fred withdrew his confession, saying that he worked alone, and instead he would accuse Rose of almost total culpability of the murders. Except Anne McFall. He did then try and blame Rena for that one. Now, the strict suicide watch that Fred was placed under ended, and on the 1st of January 1995, Fred West committed suicide. He made himself a rope from a blanket and stolen laundry tags, wrapped it round his neck, bound it to the door handle of his cell and also his window catch, and then dropped to his knees. Not a pleasant way to go. Fred would leave a suicide note, and at the bottom of it he drew a gravestone, and on it he wrote, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West. Rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace he waits for Rose, his wife." She really was the love of his life. Maybe if she'd have been a half-decent person, Fred could have turned it around. I doubt it, but you never know. Just the same as if Rose had fallen in love with a decent person. Maybe she could have been reformed, because she didn't sound too bad at the beginning, did she, when she was taking out the kids and making Fred take them to pick for wildflowers and stuff. But then she also willingly had sex with her father. Not even going to try and delve into this one. I may just explode my own brain if I do. So, after Fred's suicide, Rose had the additional charge of Charmaine's murder added to her list. As we said, the odontology, the teeth, proved that Charmaine was murdered when Fred was in prison. So the 2 counts of rape and indecent assault of the young girl and boy were dropped, with the view to resubmit it at a later date. Rose's trial would then start on the 3rd of October 1995 at Winchester Crown Court in front of Mr. Justice Mantle. That's another name that comes up in my degree studies. The judge would make an early decision, and that was to include the testimonies relating to Fred and Rose's sexual mistreatment of 3 women. It was accepted by the prosecution's argument that it established a pattern of behaviour that would be repeated in the murders. Now, prosecutor Brian Levison would call the Wests sex-obsessed, sadistic murderers. In a nutshell, he said that the bodies hidden were secrets more terrible than words can express, and he highlighted the fact that Fred had been in prison when Charmaine was killed. He would say that the Wests learned from their mistake of letting Caroline Owens live, and the scarf that had been found tied around Therese had a feminine touch to it because it had been tied in a bow. Yeah, can't imagine Fred tying pretty bows, can you? Could be wrong. Just doesn't seem like a bow man. Levison also promised to demonstrate Rose's controlling and sexually sadistic character, and also her efforts to deflect about the disappearances of the victims. Now, Rose's counsel, Richard Ferguson, tried to discredit the prosecution's witnesses as having financially exploited their case connection, which Caroline Owens admitted she did take £20,000 for a payout for her story. But she did also have extreme survivor's guilt, which is understandable, and she just wanted to get justice for the girls who didn't make it. And Ferguson also accused the prosecution witnesses of having a grudge against the Wests. Pretty sure if you've been subjected to some sort of torture by someone, you're going to have a bit of a grudge, some resentment, hatred. Perfectly normal feelings to have, as long as you don't let them destroy you, but easier said than done. And Ferguson would also point out and really emphasise the fact that Fred had actually murdered at least once before he met Rose, and that murder was similar to those in the present case, and he concluded that poor Rose had simply been completely unaware of the extent of Fred's sadism and urged the jury to not be prejudiced by her promiscuity and domineering manner. Wow. Her counsel's worth his money, give him that. Rose would go on to testify against her counsel's advice. I mean, it's not surprising that they didn't want her to testify. This is Rose West. And her manner on the stand would ping-pong. 1 minute she would go from tearful and morose to then being upbeat and humorous. She would weep as she described her horrific childhood abuse and rape. Say she naively married a violent, domineering man, but would then joke about things like always being pregnant, and even laughing about one of the victim's grandfather glasses. How disrespectful. But why am I expecting decency from this woman? Rose tried to say that she hadn't met 6 of the victims, and apparently could only recall very little of her assault on Caroline Owens. Anyone else here not believe her? Rose would be shown photographs of the cellar victims, and also of Alison Chambers, and when the prosecution asked if she recognised any of these women, Rose was said to go bright red and stutter, "No, sir, no, sir." Guilt seeping through, maybe? We know she wasn't a great liar. Sadistic evil bitch, yes. Liar, no. I mean, just look at the various stories she told about Heather's whereabouts. Nothing consistent except her wrath. Rose tried to claim in court that she and Fred had lived separate lives at Cromwell Street. Obviously, this was a massive lie, and also inconsistent with the witness testimonies that they'd already heard from previous lodgers. See? Shit liar. Rose told the court that her relationship with Heather was strained, and she then claimed that the girl was a lesbian and psychologically abused her siblings. Are we projecting a little there, Rose? Definitely sounds more like you. Rose also stated that she loved Heather and denied any knowledge of her murder. Now, We know that both Fred and Rose gave contradictory stories about Heather's whereabouts, and Rose claimed that this was because of phone conversations that they had had with Heather herself after her disappearance. Really, Rose? Really? The defence would call 7 consecutive women who all claimed to have been attacked and or assaulted by a lone male matching Fred's description between 1966 and 1975. They would each testify that they recognised their attacker when his picture was in the media in 1994. Imagine that. They were attacked. Nothing done about it because, forensics and things weren't great back then. And then all of a sudden, 20, 30 years later, his face is in the paper. That would be a bit of a moment, wouldn't it? So the defence then used the testimonies of the women to emphasise that Fred was more than capable of abducting, attacking and assaulting women without Rose. And the prosecution never disputed this. Because why would they? The final witness to be called was Janet Leach, Fred's court-appointed appropriate adult. And Janet would testify that through her role, Fred had actually come to see her as a confidant. And he had confided in her that he and Rose had made a pact the night before he was arrested. Remember the kids had seen them whispering in the kitchen? Well, this pact was that Fred would take responsibility for all of the murders, even though some he described as Rose's mistakes. Mistakes. Fred also confided that Rose had in fact killed Charmaine whilst he was in prison, and that she had also killed Shirley Robinson, remember the teenager pregnant with Fred's baby. She added that Fred had also told her Rose had taken part in the mutilation and dismemberment of Shirley, even being the one to remove the unborn baby from the dead girl's womb. Just heebie-jeebies. Something just walked over my... Nope. Janet also testified that Fred had told her Rose played a major part in the other 8 murders that she was accused of, but Fred was the one who did the dismembering. And Janet Leach would even collapse whilst delivering her testimony. There would be 7 long weeks of evidence, and then the jury would be sent away to deliberate. Now, the judge emphasised that circumstantial evidence can be sufficient for returning a guilty verdict, which I have such a fucking massive issue with. I mean, we're going to talk about the Luke Mitchell case at some point in the future. No forensic evidence on this boy whatsoever. But there was forensic evidence of others. Botched investigation where the body was left out overnight in the rain. And as such, we've got a teenage boy locked up on a purely circumstantial conviction. It's disgusting. It's wrong. And it definitely does not mean that justice has been served, especially in that case. I could get my soapbox out and go off on a whole fucking tangent about that one, but we'll save that for another day. The judge would also remind the jury that if 2 people take part in a murder, then the law considers them equally guilty, regardless of who actually did the deed. That one I'm more aligned with, not the circumstantial shit. Especially with something this serious. Well, it's a bit like Lucy Letby, isn't it, as well? That's all circumstantial. The jury would deliberate, and on the 21st and 22nd of November 1995, they returned unanimous guilty verdicts for all 10 murders. Mr. Justice Mantle would call Rose's crimes appalling and depraved, and he sentenced her to life in prison and stated that she should never be paroled. Rose would initially be incarcerated at HMP Bronzefield as a Category A prisoner, the worst of the worst. Then she was sent to HMP Low Newton before being moved in 2019 to HMP Newhall, and this was after she was threatened by another inmate and fellow serial killer Julie McAllister. She said that she pummeled Rose after being infuriated that she was getting fan mail behind bars. People were writing into Rose with friggin' marriage proposals. Words fell, just as Bailey Sarian says, get better idols. Set your bar a little bit higher than sadistic, abusive murderer. Please. So between 1967 and 1987, there were 12 known murders. Fred did allude to there being other victims, but other than confessing to murdering 15-year-old Mary Basshom In 1968, Mary was last seen waiting for a bus, but to this day her body has never been recovered, despite various potential sites. And Fred also claimed to have hidden one victim whilst working on a construction site in Birmingham, and that he'd also buried bodies in Scotland and Herefordshire. So all over the bloody place. Janet Leach said that he revealed to her that there were up to 20 more victims, and he had intended to identify one a year. He also explained that the missing phalanges were due to fingers and toes he cut off during torture, and other forms of torture included removing fingernails, mutilation, and stubbing out cigarettes on victims' bodies. The locations of all the bodies were allegedly symbolic to Fred. They were at or very close to where he lived or was working at the time of that particular murder. Mae West believes that her parents may have had as many as 30 more victims. She also revealed that Brother Stephen had been tricked by their father into digging what he thought was going to be a pond, but it was in fact Heather's grave. And that she and Stephen had actually set up a trap for their parents. They played Fred and Rose episodes from Prime Suspect and Brookside, which featured bodies being buried under patios. The kids would watch for any reaction from the pair, but said nothing suggested that they were uncomfortable. And that was their daughter under the patio. It just beggars belief, doesn't it? Fred West would be cremated on the 29th of March 1995, and his funeral was only attended by 4 of his children. It was a 5-minute affair with no hymns. And the Reverend Robert Simpson also added that we must also remember everyone else who has suffered because of these tragic events. It's believed that Fred's ashes were scattered at Barry Island, a Welsh seaside town that he used to visit as a child and as an adult with his family, and yes, home of Gavin and Stacey. After Fred's arrest in 1994, the 4 youngest children were not only taken into care, but they were given new identities as well. Rena and Charmaine's remains were cremated together. Anna Marie insisted that they share a coffin and that there were absolutely no roses at the service. Sadly, Anna Marie would attempt suicide in 1995, just 2 weeks after testifying against her stepmother, and again in 1999 by throwing herself off a bridge into the River Severn. Anna said that she didn't speak out about the abuse when she was younger because, as a child and an adolescent, she hadn't known any other normality, and her father and her stepmother were all she had, because of course she had no idea where her mother was. That's just immeasurably sad. Stephen also attempted to hang himself in 2002, and in 2004, Stephen West would be jailed for 9 months for having unlawful sex multiple times with a 14-year-old girl, and he was in his 30s. So the apple didn't necessarily fall far from the tree. There are also lots of other rumours surrounding Stephen. I'm not going to go into those because I don't want to get sued. But allegedly he knows more than he lets on. But we'll leave it at that, shall we? Even after the Wests were arrested and Fred was dead, there was another victim. January 1996, and the body of Terence Crick was found in his car. He was just 48. Terence had been well acquainted with Fred when they both lived on the Lake House Caravan Park in 1969. Now, bless him, Terence had actually tried to stop Fred, even back then. Terence reported Fred several times to the police after he'd been shown surgical instruments that Fred claimed that he used to perform abortions, and also Polaroid pictures of victims' genitals that he claimed he'd taken right after the procedures. Now, Crick believed that his information was ignored because, and get this, Fred West was also a known police informant. Fuck's sake. Stop protecting your snitches. Christ, some of them probably become snitches in the first place because they know you'll protect them. It's not because they want to help. Not always, okay? There probably are some that genuinely do want to help. But, what is it? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer? Now, the stress and guilt over the information that he'd provided to the police and the fact that no charges were brought about it, to then find out what Fred had been up to all those years, was just Too much for Terence, and his cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, in March of 1996, and Rose West intended to appeal. She claimed that the press coverage had made the witness testimony unreliable. There was no physical evidence. But this was rejected. She claimed that the press coverage had made the witness testimony unreliable and that there was no physical evidence. This was rejected, and in July of 1997, the then Home Secretary Jack Straw subjected Rose to a whole life tariff. This would mean that she would never be eligible for parole. The House of Horrors on Cromwell Street was demolished in October 1996, and all the debris was destroyed to stop souvenir hunters. Because, people would go out and go, oh, look, I've got a bit of a wall. I'm going to stick it on eBay. Was eBay even around then? No, but it is now. Stick it on eBay for 10 grand. Woo! And somebody'd probably be stupid enough to pay it as well. That's the scary thing. So the hole where the house was would later be redeveloped into a public walkway. The tragedies don't stop there, though. Fred's younger brother John hung himself in his garage on the eve of the jury retiring to deliberate his trial for the alleged rapes of his niece Anna Marie and another underage girl at Cromwell Street in the 70s. What a fucking family. Now, initially, both of Rose's elder biological children, so May and Stephen, and her stepdaughter would visit her in prison. But by 2006, contact with May had ended because May had been questioning Rose about her role in everything. And Rose said, I was never a parent then and could never be one now. But yet, like I've said, she started so well with Charmaine and Anna Marie. The only visitor Rose receives now, ironically, is stepdaughter Anna Marie, who later changed her name to Anne Marie. In 2004, the youngest West child, Barry, bless him, claimed that he had actually witnessed Heather's murder. He said that his parents had restrained, sexually and physically abused her, with Rose stamping repeatedly on the poor girl's head until she stopped moving. Now, I don't know how you could do that to anyone anyway, but your own daughter, your own child. Sadly, in October 2020, Barry would commit suicide. His cause of death was a suspected drug overdose, and in the years prior to this, he was known to have battled drug addiction and also psychiatric problems as a result of the abuse he both witnessed and endured as a child. The same month as Barry's suicide, Rose revealed more plans to appeal, but by September 2001, she'd abandoned them. She claimed that she wouldn't feel free even if she was released. And Rose West maintains her innocence to this day. Deluded? Mentally unstable? Both? Or is there the tiniest glimmer that she may actually be telling the truth? I certainly don't think so. What about you? So, that brings us to the end of our first two-parter. What do you think? Thank you so much if you made it this far. It's been a ride, hasn't it? So next week, I think we're off to the Eastern State Penitentiary. Might change, might not. Just have to tune in and find out, won't you? So please remember to like, share and subscribe so that we can keep growing. I will be eternally grateful. I am eternally grateful. And sorry for nothing knows. Hopefully I'll sound a bit better next week. But as always, if you would like to send me content requests, feedback, or for your Seriously You stories of the weird and wonderful, it's seriouslynowpod@gmail.com, and you can find me on the socials at seriouslynowpod. So until next time, my lovelies, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.